and welcome to this Tutor to You Economics Teacher webinar focusing on how to prepare your students for this summer's AQA Economics Synoptic Paper 3. Before we start, just a quick reminder about our upcoming Grade Booster and Flying Start Revision workshops at a View Cinema near you. And from the Tutor to You shop, very relevant to this particular webinar, our series of synoptic placemats designed as resources for students to complete on their own, mark on their own if they choose to, looking at micro and macro aspects of a variety of different case studies. The ever popular glossary is also available to buy as a booklet or as digital download, and available now and coming also very shortly, the series of model essay booklets full of examiner commentary, essay structure advice. So do pop onto the Tutor to You shop, the Tutor to You website, to find those resources to help support you in this essential exam preparation series. Okay, so what are we going to take a look at in the course of this webinar? Well, firstly, really to have a look at the demands of this new paper 3 for A level and the impact that it has on your teaching and the revision period. We'll be gaining a little bit of confidence, hopefully, with the synoptic exam technique, and I'll be touching on a few ways that you can use in the classroom to help students revise in a more synoptic way. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, just a quick overview. What on earth is paper 3? Well, firstly, it covers all of the microeconomic and macroeconomic content from both years, the AS and the second year of the A Level Economics course. That means there is no new material for paper 3, but it does test a variety of different thinking skills. Overall, it's worth 1/3 of the A level. It's equally weighted to papers 1 and 2. And in terms of the structure, there are 30 multiple choice questions worth 1 mark each that cover all of the content across micro and macro from both years, in addition to a 50-mark investigation based on a series of short extracts and data in which students must write in an extended way. There are a variety of challenges of this synoptic exam. From students' perspective, many are not very sure about the difference between micro and macro, particularly true if they have just one teacher for the subject or if their teachers switch between micro and macro. Many students are also finding it very difficult to make connections between different bits of the course when it's actually taught in quite a linear step-by-step way. In terms of teachers, one of the biggest concerns is how do we fit in all the teaching and who is responsible for helping students prepare for paper 3. In the case of centres where there is a single teacher, a sole teacher covering micro and macro, it can be pretty straightforward in terms of preparation because those teachers know exactly what their students have covered. However, for centres where there is both micro and macro as separate teachers, it can be a real challenge to think about how to separate up the revision process for that synoptic paper. Before we take a look at some of the detailed issues relating to paper 3, there are a few quotes there on the screen from emails and conversations I've had with teachers up and down the country in relation to the synoptic element of the new Economics A level. Hopefully one of those will resonate with you. Hopefully you're not in the same boat as the poor teacher who provided the comment in the top left there and not even really aware that there was a synoptic paper. Hopefully everyone listening to this webinar recording will be well aware that this is one of the demands placed on teaching this year. So the exams paper structure. We've had a quick look at this already in terms of identifying multiple choice questions and the investigation, but in a little bit more depth. Section A, 30 multiple choice questions, 1 mark each, mixture of the AS and second year content, and as we've already said, covers micro and macro. This is the easiest place on the exam papers to test those all-important quantitative skills, which, as I'm sure you know, is a minimum 20% across the whole A-level assessment, so across all 3 papers. Multiple choice questions are a very easy way of testing things such as calculations, use of formulae, ratios, and interpretation of charts and graphs. We suggest very strongly that students spend no longer than 45 minutes out of this 2-hour paper tackling the multiple choice questions. Clearly, some of the more straightforward definition type questions from the AS material, they will achieve that much more quickly than some of the more demanding calculation questions, for example, relating to the second year content. Section B is the investigation, worth 50 marks, so weighted slightly heavier in terms of synoptic content. There is a 10-mark data comparison and handling exercise, a 15-mark explanation question requiring analysis and AO3 skills, and a 25-mark essay, or what I would call the judgment question, in which students have to provide a clear recommendation based on the data in the extracts and their own economic knowledge. Let's take a look first of all at the multiple choice question. That's section A. There are a range of multiple choice question types that students may meet. These are shown on the screen. If we start at the top and work our way around clockwise, we can see that whilst multiple choice questions are often seen as one style of questioning, there are in fact a range of ways of a variety of ways of tackling these questions. Most simply, at the top there, the concept of the definition question. These are perhaps the most straightforward and a really good reason for students to get stuck in and really learn all of their definitions. These should be the very easy to gain marks for all students, even those at the EU grade boundary. So definition questions, clearly these could be, for example, a very straightforward question in which the question stem might say something like a good definition of, say, any concept. The multiplier, for example, is, and then options A, B, C and D provide different definitions, of which only one is the correct definition of the multiplier. The other type of definition question that is quite common is for the definition to appear in the question stem, and students have to identify the key term or concept. So a kind of a forwards approach and a backwards approach. Calculations are the other really obvious way in which examiners are expecting most students to be able to pick up marks. Now, in terms of the AS content, the most likely questions there in terms of micro are probably something to do with elasticities. They can obviously require them to rearrange formulae. Students do need to be extremely confident, not just with knowing the formulae, but how to manipulate data, how to put information into a formula, and how to potentially rearrange that formula to find the information that they require. I'll show you an example of what I mean by that later on in the course of this webinar. Diagram interpretation, for example, this could be actually being given a diagram and asked to work out, based on a couple of scenarios, exactly what the implications might be for the diagram, which curves may shift, what the new equilibrium point may be, or in terms of some of the second year content, identifying different points on the diagram and relating them to perhaps, say, concepts such as the natural rate of unemployment, if, say, students have a Phillips curve, or say the revenue maximising point on a monopoly diagram. So being given a diagram and asked to write about it, well, interpret the diagram, or indeed being given a scenario and then asked to think about what the impact would be. Now, in many cases, lots of students would benefit from drawing a diagram. Some questions are difficult to do in their heads. And I would really want to encourage you to get your students to draw diagrams onto the question paper if they feel that that would help. Other types of questions there that I've called policy combination. So thinking about the effects of things such as taxes, subsidies for micro, potentially supply side fiscal policy, monetary policy for macro, and thinking about the effect on objectives and business outcomes. Data interpretation, often one that we might overlook as economics teachers. In a sense, these questions might not necessarily require much economics knowledge, but do indeed require students to be able to read tables, charts, graphs. Do take a look at the quantitative skills list in the appendix at the back of the specification. That should give you a clear idea of the types of data that students could be expected to meet and what they need to be confident with for the multiple choice questions. So I'm going to show you 3 examples now of multiple choice questions in which relatively straightforward knowledge is actually needed by students, but they do need to think on their feet and think outside the box, as well as jump through a number of hoops and go through a series of processes in order to answer the question. So on the screen, you should be able to see a table providing data on output levels and the associated total revenue and total costs in thousands of pounds. Now, students might be given that very basic amount of information, and you can see what I've done there is leave blank some columns, which obviously students could use to complete their own calculations. But in the actual exam, they may find that there are no obvious blank columns and they may have to just create their own and annotate their answers. Annotation, I'm going to keep coming back to that, annotating on the exam paper is a really good way of making sure that students are getting the right answer. Doing calculations, drawing diagrams, writing formulae, for example. So how could the data on the screen there possibly be tested in terms of multiple choice? Well, here are 3 possible ideas, but there are undoubtedly many more. For example, students could be given that data and asked to calculate the average fixed cost at a given level of output. I've suggested there output level 5. Now, this clearly requires students to know their definition of total fixed costs, which is the amount of costs incurred when the output level is 0. Now, in this case, knowing that definition should lead students very quickly into identifying total fixed cost. In this case, it's £20,000. The little potential banana skin or slip up there that students might make is not spotting that that is indeed in thousands of pounds. They're then asked to calculate the average fixed costs. Now, calculating averages is on the quantitative skills list given in the back of the specification. Students do need to know that an average is simply a total divided by a quantity. In this case, they would do £20,000 divided by output 5, which gives them £4,000. It's worth remembering that the incorrect answers in the multiple choice possible options will be numbers that are perfectly plausible for students to calculate based on the common errors. So, for example, there would undoubtedly be one possible answer that divided 83,000 by 5, in other words, average total cost. There might even be another number that's just 20,000, where students get confused between total fixed costs and average fixed cost. So just because students find an answer that matches their calculation solution doesn't necessarily mean that the answer they have is the correct answer. It's vitally important that they really think about what they're doing, because the incorrect answers have been very carefully chosen by examiners and in anticipation of common errors. In the yellow box there at the bottom of the screen, I've indicated a couple of other types of questions that could easily appear based on that simple data. For example, the profit maximising level of output. Now, clearly there are 2 ways into that based on the information here. Students could simply calculate the difference between total revenue and total cost and identify where profit is highest, or they could go into more detail and look at marginal revenue and marginal cost and find where those are equal. So 2 ways into that one. The final bullet point there, looking at allocative efficiency or productive efficiency. Clearly for these, students would need to know the various conditions. So allocative efficiency, average revenue equals marginal cost, or productive efficiency, lowest average cost, or indeed where marginal cost equals average cost. And that's where those additional columns in the table come into play. We would expect students to be able to think on their feet and work out which bits of information they need, which ones are missing, and how they can go about finding them. It's effectively a problem-solving exercise. Here's another example where actually it's a very, very easy question, but students might not quite be able to see their way through it. So we're given data on GDP, consumer spending, investment spending, and net exports, and asked to calculate the value of government spending. Some students would potentially look quite blankly at you and say, but we don't know a formula for government spending. But what they do need to do is think about the information they're given and see if they know a formula that is related to it. In this case, it's aggregate demand, AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. They need to plug in the information that they have. In this case, they also need to do a percentage calculation. Given that they're told that consumer spending is 50% of GDP, they would then need to work out that consumer spending is 50% of $50 billion, clearly $250 billion. They would then need to rearrange the formula to find the missing component, that of government spending. Please do ensure that you have practiced formula rearranging with your students. It is indeed a key stage 3 skill, but many of them often leave their mathematical skills at the door of their economics classroom. So it's well worth making sure that your students can rearrange a formula effectively. That same skill is required in this question. This time another macro question, but related to the multiplier. And this is, again, a sort of back to front calculation question. They're given the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, and from that they should be able to use their knowledge of the multiplier formula. So in this case that would be 1 divided by 1 take away 0.8, so 1 over 0.2. The multiplier in this case is 5. They're told that the national income, the total change in national income is 300 million. So they need to be able to think on their feet and how to get from having the multiplier and the total change and how to work backwards towards the initial injection. In this case, the answer is C, £60 million. So rearranging formulae in terms of adding and taking away, and in this case, for this question, rearranging formulae in terms of multiplying and dividing as well. Very much worth practicing. Quick mnemonic. I love mnemonics in my teaching. This is my approach for multiple choice questions. The mnemonic is read, which should help them to complete the very first bit of that mnemonic, which is actually read the question stem first, followed by all the answers carefully. Then eliminate anything wrong or obviously silly. Annotate. I keep coming back to this. Students really can annotate on their exam papers, and I encourage them to do so. Drawing diagrams, writing formulae, carrying out calculations, writing definitions. And then deciding, working through each answer in turn in order to decide or eliminate. Being systematic is very helpful. At the very least, if they can get it down to 2 answers, they've then effectively got a 50-50 chance rather than a 1 in 4 chance of at least guessing the right answer. So, the investigation. This is the bit that I think is causing students and teachers perhaps most concern. The investigation consists of a source booklet with 4 or 5 sources or short extracts, including data tables, a 10 mark, a 15 mark and a 25 mark question, and it's all in the form of extended writing. In terms of reading and how to approach the investigation, here's what I would suggest. Firstly, a quick scan and skim of the extracts, of which there is likely to be 4 or 5. So no more than 2 minutes really initially to just quickly skim over the key information and get a sense of what it's all about. Then read through the questions very carefully before rereading more slowly and thoroughly to get a really good sense of which bits of data are going to be most useful. Only annotate and highlight or underline the most useful information. So 10-mark data handling question. The specimen papers provided by AQA, the one that is available freely and easily online, and the other one which is accessed through the AQA system. Ask your exams officer for access if you need to access that. The two papers have a slightly different approach. One is about comparing and contrasting the performance of countries, and that's the one online. And then the one behind the AQA login is about looking at the extent to which data supports something. Clearly, that second one requires more data evaluation skills than the first, so students should be prepared to do a little evaluation in the 10-mark question. In terms of technique, 3 points of comparison or 3 points of reference are ideal. Students must quote data and they must use the correct units. This is also true of the very short questions, the 2-mark calculation questions on papers 1 and 2 in the data responses. Units are essential. Students must also understand the limitations of various elements of economic data. So, for example, it might mean understanding that you may have outliers, that whether the data is given as a mean or a median might affect how you interpret that data. They might also want to look at how frequently it's collected, and whether they're estimates or forecasts, the actual limitations of the measures. So, for example, in a macro paper, assuming they are given data about GDP, inflation, and say unemployment via the claimant count, being able to evaluate the effectiveness of those measures. So, for example, the claimant count underestimating the amount of unemployment in an economy, because it can often be really difficult to access things such as job seekers allowance. In a sense, that is taking them right back to some of the stuff that you probably covered with your students at the start of their AS macro course. It's also essential that in that paper students reach a judgment that is backed up by evidence. Now, this only needs to be brief. It's only a 10-mark question, but a sentence, 2 at the most, is needed in order to reach a judgment. The 15-mark explain question, strong chains of analysis are essential. If we look at the examples from AQA, in the set available as part of the sample assessment material freely available on the website, the question is there on the screen for you. As you can see, it's very open-ended. More specific is the question in specimen set 2, asking candidates to look at the effects on individuals, in a sense micro, and the economy, or macro. In terms of how to help students think about micro and macro concepts, we have some more mnemonics. Firstly, this idea of the popsicle for micro, looking at the impact on price, output, profits, structure of the market, inefficiency, level of competition or even contestability, labour markets, and I've included externalities there as a kind of catch-all phrase for market failure. For macro, I've gone for digestive, and you can see there the kinds of things that students could be talking about when they're considering the impact on an economy of something or a change. The 25-mark recommendation question, the discursive essay question, is effectively marked in the same way as the 25-mark essay questions from papers 1 and 2. A careful reading of the mark schemes tells us that the bands of response, the levels of response, are in fact identical. So examiners are looking for students to demonstrate the same sorts of skills. If we look at the questions available from AQA, we can see that the first one is fairly broad, and students will have to think quite hard about their recommendation. In the second set, there's a very specific question about regional minimum wages. Now, this did raise my eyebrows when I saw it because that particular concept is not explicitly on the specification. Students do, however, have the skills and knowledge, or they should have the skills and knowledge to be able to tackle that question using their existing knowledge. They should expect new scenarios. They should have to think on their feet. The more practice you do with them, just introducing short examples and short case studies in the classroom, the more confident they will be in terms of thinking about these sorts of ideas. They must use as much data and evidence as possible. Absolutely essential that they back up their arguments. It's really important to note that marks are capped at 13 out of 25 if there is no evidence of evaluation. That is likely to catch out some students who have a very clear viewpoint in terms of their recommendation. It's really, really important that even if they believe something very strongly, that they do actually evaluate and think about what might affect their particular argument. For the top band marks, there absolutely must be a final conclusion that builds on their previous argument. A way that I think works with students in terms of explaining this is that it's not just good enough to say, yes, I recommend this, or no, I don't. They actually need to really think about what arguments they have that justify. So justifying their answer is vitally important. And a way into that, as I've mentioned at the bottom of the slide there, is what I would call a recommendation with caveats. So yes, Brazil should, the UK car manufacturer should invest in Brazil, but maybe in the future, maybe not now because of a particular reason. So coming up with a slightly sort of quirkier or more clever answer, not just a yes or a no, but a yes but only if, or a no but that might change if sort of answer. So the essential ingredients for success here: fantastic use of economic terminology wherever possible. Depth of content. Students must have excellent depth of knowledge as evidenced by that particular regional minimum wage question in the second specimen set, but they must also be able to think very broadly across micro and macro. Diagrams. They are given very few steers in this paper, particularly in the investigation, about which diagrams would be appropriate. They need to practice thinking about selecting the right diagrams from their sort of armoury of diagrams that they have. Accurate writing and excellent use of English is a given. They must watch the timing. So 45 minutes max really on the multiple choice questions. A good 10 minutes or so of reading of the investigation sources before then delving into their answers. They probably want to allow a good half an hour for that 25 mark recommendation question. Data skills, clearly very, very important. Obvious synoptic topics. I've drawn together a few here that I think really lend themselves to both a micro and a macro treatment. This might be a slide that you want to pause on and just digest in your own time. In terms of revision, the last couple of minutes here, how to use the specification as an effective revision tool. All students should have a copy of the specification in their folders. Take each topic a bit at a time and make connections. I've suggested a few here. Thinking about derived demands, I've picked up on transport being another example. We could link into cyclical unemployment here. Thinking about the marginal product and average product curve in the teaching of diminishing marginal returns and how we derive short run average costs. Looking at the factors that shift the demand curve, a review of some of their AS micro, tying in to this year 13 micro. Thinking about the impact of rising marginal product on long run aggregate supply, making a macro synoptic connection. And you can do this with every single bit of the syllabus. Similarly, use case studies. This was a quick 10-minute find on the BBC News website last week. Pop a little case study into the middle of a large sheet of A4 or A3 paper. Find the key terms, ask students to define them, and then make as many synoptic connections as possible. So the first paragraph there, evidence of income elasticity of demand. Looking at problems with forecasting. We've got information there that helps us to review the circular flow of income. Looking at the pros and cons of targets, different types of protectionism, and thinking about the balance of payments. So a very, very short article that allows us to explore and revise 6 big topics. A few top tips there for you to take a look at. I don't need to read them out. You can pause on this slide and take a good look at those yourself. Quick reminder, if you're looking for interesting ways of testing definitions in the classroom without it appearing like a test, please do take a look at the Tutor2U PowerPoint games, which you can buy from the Tutor2U shop. Lots and lots of fun, lots and lots of effective testing, but without it seeming like a test. Quick reminder of where the resources will appear. Do take a look on the Tutor2U blog as revision draws closer. If you're not a member of the Relevant Economics Facebook page, do take a look at that. There's a fantastic community of supportive teachers on there sharing ideas all the time. Particularly useful if you are a sole teacher of economics, just wanting to check what you're doing. So thank you very much for listening to this webinar. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. We love to hear from the economics teacher community. You can easily get me on email on ruth@tutor2u.net, and hopefully we'll see you on a webinar or at one of our student events very soon.